The blood-curdling screams of the Korlax filled the night as their Ventaxian owners abandoned them to starve on the hostile alien world of Zeta 9. Scott Wright gripped the controls of his space vessel hard, his breaths heaving heavily in his chest as he listened to the desperate, haunting alien distress signal. He was a hardened space explorer who had seen countless alien species come and go, but something about the raw pain and suffering in those eerie alien wails made his blood run cold. Something terrible had happened on Zeta 9, something so horrifying that an advanced spacefaring race would rather condemn their beloved pets to slow, agonizing deaths than risk staying on that cursed rock a moment longer. Scott clenched his jaw and gunned the thrusters, his ship rocketing toward the coordinates given in the distress call. He knew deep in his bones that the humans were the Korlax's only hope now. No other alien races would dare set foot on plague-ridden Zeta 9, not after an outbreak terrifying enough to make the cold-blooded Ventaxians flee in sheer panic. But humans had a code: never leave a man or beast behind. Even if that beast was a 600-pound alien killing machine that the galaxy called a pet. Besides, Scott had never discovered a new species before. If he could get the Korlax off-world and into a lab, it would make his career. He'd go down in history as the human who saved the Korlax from extinction after their owners left them to rot. If he succeeded, that is. If he failed, well, Scott would be just another foolhardy human explorer whose bleached bones were scattered across the uncaring stars. Because he had a gut feeling, as his ship drew closer to the deathly silent Zeta 9, that the Korlax weren't the only hungry things prowling that world, and that something far worse than just a plague had spooked the unflappable Ventaxians. Scott's heart raced as he stepped into the enclosure. The smell of blood, sweat, and fear hung heavy in the air. He swung his flashlight beam across the space, illuminating the huddled forms of the Korlax. They were massive creatures, easily twice his size, with thick leathery hides and razor-sharp claws. But now they cowered in the shadows, their eyes wide with terror. Suddenly a movement caught Scott's eye. A single Korlax, larger and more vibrant than the others, rose from the darkness. Its eyes gleamed with an unsettling intelligence as it approached him, its movements cautious, yet curious. Scott's breath caught in his throat. He knew he should be afraid, but something about this creature drew him in. Slowly, Scott extended his hand, his heart pounding in his chest. The Korlax, which he would later learn was named Primus, leaned forward and gently nuzzled his palm. For a moment, everything else fell away. It was just Scott and Primus, two beings from different worlds, connected by a shared moment of trust. But the peace was shattered by a piercing screech from above. Scott's head snapped up, his eyes widening in horror as a flock of strange, bat-like creatures descended upon the enclosure. Their razor-sharp talons tore at the Korlax's flesh, sending sprays of blood across the ground. The creatures screamed in agony, their cries mixing with the shrieks of their attackers. Scott knew he had to act fast. He raced back to his ship, his fingers flying over the controls as he activated the vessel's advanced technology. A shimmering force field sprang up around the enclosure, repelling the bat creatures and sending them scattering into the night. As the attackers retreated, Scott's gaze fell upon a peculiar device attached to Primus's neck. It was a transmitter of some kind, blinking with an eerie green light. Carefully, Scott reached out and removed it. Instantly, Primus's demeanor changed. The Korlax became more relaxed, more friendly, as if a great weight had been lifted from its shoulders. Scott turned the device over in his hands, his mind racing with questions. What was its purpose? Why had the Ventaxians left it on Primus? And what secrets might it hold? But there was no time to ponder such mysteries now. The Korlax needed his help. With the immediate threat gone, Scott set to work tending to their wounds, providing them with food and water, and doing his best to comfort them in their time of need. As he worked, however, Scott couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and a chill ran down his spine. He glanced around the enclosure, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Just the Korlax, huddled together in the shadows and the endless expanse of stars above. Little did Scott know that hidden cameras monitored his every move, transmitting footage to a distant, shadowy figure who watched with keen interest. The figure, a Ventaxian scientist named Dr. Zortex, leaned back in his chair, a cruel smile playing across his lips. "The human has taken the bait," he muttered to himself. "Now the real experiment can begin." As the sun rose and set over the desolate landscape of Zeta 9, Scott found himself falling into a routine. Each day he would check on the Korlax, ensuring they had enough food and water and tending to their wounds. He spent hours in their enclosure, observing their behavior and trying to understand their unique vocalizations. Primus, in particular, seemed to take a keen interest in Scott, often following him around and watching him with those piercing, intelligent eyes. As the Korlax regained their strength, Scott began to explore the abandoned Ventaxian settlement with Primus by his side. The once thriving colony was now a ghost town, its buildings empty and its streets eerily silent. Scott couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened here, something that went beyond a simple outbreak. One day, as they were searching through the ruins of a dilapidated laboratory, Scott stumbled upon a series of encrypted files. It took him hours to crack the code, but when he finally gained access, what he found sent a chill down his spine. The files detailed a sinister Ventaxian experiment involving the Korlax. The creatures, it seemed, were not just pets, but genetically engineered living weapons designed to unleash a devastating virus upon command. Scott's mind raced as he read through the files, piecing together the horrifying truth. The transmitter he had removed from Primus was not just a tracking device, but a failsafe meant to keep the Korlax under control. Without it, the creatures could become unpredictable, even dangerous. As he delved deeper into the files, Scott stumbled upon a recorded message from Dr. Zortex, the mastermind behind the experiment. The Ventaxian scientist spoke in a cold, clinical tone, his words sending a shiver down Scott's spine. The outbreak was no accident, Zortex revealed. It was a test, a way to see how the virus would spread in a controlled population. We fled not out of fear, but to observe from a safe distance. Scott felt a wave of nausea wash over him as the realization hit. He and the Korlax were nothing more than pawns in a twisted game, unwitting participants in a madman's experiment. He knew he had to find a way to stop Zortex, to prevent the virus from spreading beyond Zeta 9. But first, he had to make sure the Korlax were safe. Back at the enclosure, Scott noticed that Primus was behaving strangely. The Korlax was listless, its movements sluggish and uncoordinated. Upon closer inspection, Scott saw that Primus was running a high fever, its skin hot to the touch. The creature's body was racked with convulsions, and a strange iridescent rash had begun to spread across its leathery hide. Scott's heart sank as he realized what was happening. The virus, it seemed, was activating within Primus, transforming the once gentle creature into something far more dangerous. He knew he had to act fast, to find a way to stop the virus before it consumed Primus and the other Korlax. Racing against time, Scott set up a makeshift lab in the enclosure, working tirelessly to analyze samples of the virus and search for a cure. He barely slept, barely ate, his mind consumed by the task at hand. All the while, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that Zortex was out there somewhere, monitoring his every move. As the days stretched on and Primus's condition worsened, Scott began to feel a creeping sense of despair. What if he couldn't find a cure in time? What if the virus spread beyond the enclosure, beyond Zeta 9? The weight of responsibility hung heavy on his shoulders, and he found himself wondering if he had made a terrible mistake by coming here in the first place. But then, just as all seemed lost, Scott had a breakthrough. Hidden deep within the encrypted files, he found a formula for a potential antidote. It was risky, untested, but it was the only hope he had. With trembling hands, he prepared the serum, praying that it would work. As he injected the antidote into Primus's veins, Scott held his breath, watching for any sign of change. At first, nothing happened. The Korlax lay still, its breathing shallow and labored. But then, slowly, Primus began to stir. Its eyes fluttered open, and it let out a soft, questioning chirp. Scott felt a wave of relief wash over him, followed quickly by a sense of dread. He had bought them some time, but he knew that Zortex would not give up so easily. The Ventaxian scientist was still out there, watching and waiting, ready to strike at any moment. Scott hunched over the Ventaxian computer terminal, his eyes bloodshot and his fingers trembling as they flew across the holographic keys. He had to find a cure, had to save Primus and the others before it was too late. The encrypted research files were a labyrinth of cold equations and clinical jargon, but Scott refused to give up. He dug deeper, peeling back layer after layer of redacted data until he uncovered the terrible truth. The virus was engineered to respond to a specific frequency, a resonance signal that would trigger the dormant pathogens and send them into a frenzy of replication. And the only device capable of transmitting that signal was hidden in the heart of the abandoned Ventaxian city, a decaying metropolis that loomed on the horizon like a cancerous growth. Scott's fists clenched as he realized what he had to do. He had to go into the city, had to find the device and destroy it before Zortex could use it to unleash the virus on a galactic scale. He glanced over at Primus, who lay shivering in the corner, its once vibrant scales now dull and lifeless. Scott's heart ached at the sight, but he pushed the pain aside. He had a mission, and he would see it through no matter the cost. As he gathered his gear and prepared to set out, a sudden explosion rocked the enclosure, sending Scott sprawling to the ground. He staggered to his feet, his ears ringing and his vision blurred, and stumbled outside to see Dr. Zortex, standing amidst the smoking ruins of the perimeter fence. The Ventaxian scientist was flanked by a squad of heavily armed soldiers, their weapons trained on Scott and the Korlax. "You've caused me quite a bit of trouble, human," Zortex sneered, his cold eyes glinting with malice. "But now it's time for you to hand over the specimens. They are the key to my plan, and I will not be denied." Scott's blood boiled at the word specimens. Primus and the others were living, sentient beings, not lab rats to be experimented on. He stepped forward, putting himself between Zortex and the Korlax. "I won't let you have them," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. "I won't let you turn them into weapons." Zortex's lips curled into a cruel smile. "You have no choice, human. You are outnumbered and outgunned. Surrender now, and I may let you live to see the fruits of my labor." But Scott had one last desperate trick up his sleeve. In the weeks since the bat creature attack, he had studied their behavior, learning how to manipulate their ultrasonic calls with a modified version of the control transmitter. With a flick of his wrist, he activated the device, sending out a piercing shriek that echoed across the compound. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, from every shadow and crevice, the bat creatures emerged, their leathery wings unfurling as they rose into the air. They swarmed towards the Ventaxian soldiers, a writhing mass of teeth and claws that tore through armor like tissue paper. In the chaos, Scott raced back to the enclosure, scooping up Primus in his arms and gesturing frantically for the other Korlax to follow. They fled into the city, Zortex's enraged screams echoing behind them as they vanished into the twisting labyrinth of streets. But the abandoned metropolis was far from empty. As they navigated the crumbling buildings and debris-choked alleys, Scott caught glimpses of movement in the shadows. Strange, twisted shapes that scuttled and lurched in the darkness, their bodies warped by the unchecked spread of the virus. Time was running out. Scott could feel it in his bones, a creeping dread that snaked up his spine and settled in the pit of his stomach. If he didn't find the device soon, if he didn't stop Zortex from activating the signal, then the virus would consume not just Zeta-9, but the entire galaxy. And as he looked into Primus's feverish eyes, he knew that failure was not an option. Scott's heart pounded in his chest as he and Primus raced through the decaying Ventaxian city, their footsteps echoing off the crumbling walls. They had to find the device, had to destroy it before Zortex could unleash his twisted vision upon the galaxy. Primus led the way, his keen senses guiding them deeper into the bowels of the abandoned metropolis. At last they reached the entrance to an underground laboratory, its heavy metal doors rusted and pitted with age. Scott's hands shook as he hacked the lock, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The doors groaned open, revealing a cavernous space filled with flickering screens and humming machinery. And there, at the center of it all, was the device. But as they approached, a figure emerged from the shadows. Dr. Zortex, his eyes glinting with madness and his body writhing with unnatural power. "You're too late," he hissed, his voice dripping with malice. "I've already injected myself with the perfected virus. Now I am more than Ventaxian, more than human. I am a god." He lunged at Scott, his movements a blur of speed and strength. Scott barely had time to raise his weapon before Zortex was upon him, his claws tearing at his flesh. Primus roared in fury, leaping to Scott's defense. The Korlak and the Ventaxian scientist grappled in a deadly dance, their bodies slamming against the walls and equipment. Scott staggered to his feet, blood dripping from his wounds. He had to reach the device, had to destroy it before Zortex could stop him, but the Ventaxian was too fast, too strong. Every time Scott got close, Zortex was there, blocking his path and throwing him back with a wave of his hand. Primus, sensing Scott's desperation, closed his eyes and reached out with his mind. He could feel the virus coursing through his veins, could sense its power and potential. With a snarl of determination, he focused that power on Zortex, sending waves of agony crashing through the Ventaxian's body. Zortex stumbled, his face contorting in pain. It was the opening Scott needed. He lunged for the device, his fingers closing around its cold metal surface. With a scream of defiance, he ripped it free from its moorings and smashed it against the floor. But as the device shattered, the laboratory shuddered and groaned. Cracks spiderwebbed across the walls and ceiling, and debris began to rain down around them. Zortex, weakened by Primus's assault, looked up in horror as a massive chunk of metal broke loose and plummeted towards him. He tried to dodge, but he was too slow. The debris crushed him, burying him beneath a pile of twisted metal and shattered glass. Scott stared in shock, his heart hammering in his chest. They had won. They had destroyed the device and stopped Zortex's plan. But at what cost? He turned to Primus, ready to celebrate their victory, but the words died on his lips. Primus was standing over him, his body trembling with the effort of holding up a massive slab of concrete that had broken loose from the ceiling. Scott realized with a sickening lurch that the Korlak was shielding him, using his own body to protect the human from the collapsing laboratory. "Primus, no!" Scott screamed, scrambling to his feet. He had to help, had to find a way to save his friend, but Primus just looked at him, his eyes filled with a sorrowful understanding. "Go," the Korlak whispered, his voice strained with pain. "Save others." And then, with a final agonized roar, Primus heaved the concrete slab upwards, throwing Scott clear of the debris. The human tumbled across the floor, his body battered and bruised but alive. He looked back just in time to see the laboratory collapse inwards, burying Primus beneath a mountain of rubble. For a long moment, Scott just lay there, his body shaking with sobs. Primus was gone, sacrificed to save him. The Korlak had given his life to protect a human, to ensure that Scott could continue the fight against those who would seek to exploit and destroy. Slowly, painfully, Scott dragged himself to his feet. He limped out of the ruins of the laboratory, his heart heavy with grief and loss. The other Korlaks were waiting for him, their eyes wide with fear and confusion. They could sense that something terrible had happened, that one of their own was gone. Scott gathered them close, his voice cracking as he tried to explain what had happened. He told them of Primus's bravery, of his sacrifice, and as he spoke, he felt a new sense of purpose growing within him. Primus's death would not be in vain. Scott would honor his memory by continuing the fight, by protecting the vulnerable and speaking for those who could not speak for themselves. As he looked up at the stars, Scott knew that his mission was far from over. The Ventaxians' twisted experiments had left a scar on the galaxy that would take generations to heal. But he would not rest until every last Korlak was safe, until every last trace of the virus was wiped from existence. With a heavy heart, Scott buried Primus's body beneath a pile of rubble, marking the spot with a simple cross made from twisted metal. Then he gathered the remaining Korlaks and set off into the unknown, a lone human warrior determined to make a difference in a galaxy full of darkness and uncertainty. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.